In the winter of 1069, the lands of northern England fell silent, not with peace, but with death.
Fields lay blackened, villages burned to the ground. The bodies of the dead, men, women, and children, lay where they had fallen. The survivors starved in the frozen wasteland, their homes reduced to ash. This was not the work of an invading army from abroad, but the will of England's own king.
We will go back to 1066. 3 years earlier, William, Duke of Normandy, had crossed the Channel and seized the English crown. His victory at Hastings in 1066 was swift, but his rule would be anything but secure. The north of England, proud, fiercely independent, and deeply loyal to the old Anglo-Saxon ways, would never bow quietly to a foreign ruler. From the windswept hills of Yorkshire to the banks of the River Tyne, whispers of rebellion spread, and William would hear them loud and clear. But this was not just another uprising. It was a challenge to his very right to rule, one that would draw in dispossessed English nobles, outlaw warriors, and even a fleet of Danish invaders. For William, it was not enough to win battles. He would have to break the spirit of the North forever. This was the harrying of the North. Tonight, we trace the chain of events that led from the harrying of the North would hear and the ode. For the voice elements able to cross the Channel, site of the Velian Catted 1066 wide, it was crossed to New the Door. Tonight, we trace the chain of events that led from a king's fragile victory to a scorched land where nothing living remained. We'll uncover the rebellions that threatened to unseat William the Conqueror, the political games played by ambitious earls and foreign kings, and the ruthless strategy that turned fertile farmlands into a barren graveyard. The Norman Conquest was not decided at Hastings. It was sealed in fire. William's coronation on Christmas Day, 1066, should have marked the beginning of a peaceful reign. The reality was anything but. England was a patchwork of loyalties, languages, and laws. The Normans had claimed the throne, but not the hearts of its people. Nowhere was that resistance stronger than in the north. For centuries, northern England had been shaped by Viking blood and Anglo-Saxon tradition. Towns like York were once strongholds of the Danelaw. They answered to their earls, not to a distant king in London, and certainly not to a foreign conqueror. To William, this autonomy was a threat. The North's power rested in the hands of two earls, Edwin of Mercia and his brother Morcar of Northumbria, men who had fought against him at Hastings and who now swore loyalty only under duress. Barely 3 months after taking the crown, William made a fateful choice. In early 1067, he sailed back to Normandy, leaving his new kingdom in the hands of his half-brother Odo of Bayeux and William Fitzosborne. It was a move meant to show confidence, but to the restless English, it signaled opportunity.
The regents ruled with a heavy hand. Norman garrisons seized manors, demanded tribute, and treated local customs with contempt. Dispossessed Anglo-Saxons, stripped of their lands, turned to outlawry, raiding Norman patrols and disappearing into the wild countryside. The North watched closely, and far away, in the court of King Sweyn II of Denmark, exiled English nobles whispered of a chance to strike back. Rebellion flared first on England's western borders. In the Welsh marches, a thane named Edric the Wild led hit-and-run attacks against Norman forces, joined by Welsh allies. These early uprisings failed to break Norman control, but they kept the embers of resistance alive. In theory, Edwin and Morcar were William's allies. In practice, they were his hostages. Their sister, Ealdgyth, widow of the fallen King Harold, was a living reminder of the royal line. William kept her under close watch. William's policy was clear: divide the great earldoms, weaken the native rulers, and replace them with his own men. By late 1067, tension was at breaking point. The Normans' castle-building program was in full swing. Families displaced by construction became beggars, their loyalty replaced by hatred. All it would take was a spark. In early 1068, Edwin and Morcar finally broke their uneasy peace. Whether driven by personal insult, William had refused Edwin's request to marry his daughter, or by pressure from their people, the brothers raised the standard of revolt. They were not alone. The city of Exeter in the southwest openly defied Norman rule, refusing to pay taxes. Across the countryside, outlaw bands attacked Norman messengers and supply trains. The uprising had begun. William responded with speed. In a campaign of brutal efficiency, he marched from one rebel stronghold to the next. Exeter was besieged and forced into submission after 18 days. Warwick fell soon after. By the time William reached York, Edwin and Morcar saw the writing on the wall and surrendered. But if the North appeared calm, it was only on the surface. The true storm was still gathering. By the end of 1068, the North had once again submitted to William's rule. But the submission was thin as ice, and in the winter ahead, it would crack wide open. York was the key to controlling the North. It was the largest city between the Humber and the Scottish border, a former Viking capital with deep trade links to Scandinavia. Whoever held York held the North. William had fortified the city with not one, but 2 castles, garrisoned with Norman troops. The message was clear. The North was no longer self-governing. In January 1069, William made a move that would ignite rebellion like never before. He appointed Robert de Comines, a Norman knight, as Earl of Northumbria, replacing the Anglo-Saxon Morcar. Robert entered Durham with a large force and with arrogance to match. Chroniclers tell us he ignored warnings from local clergy that the countryside was on the brink of revolt. That night, as his men quartered in the city, the locals struck. Before dawn, Durham erupted in violence. Armed townsfolk and Northumbrian rebels poured into the streets, setting buildings alight. Robert de Comines and his entire retinue, hundreds of Norman soldiers, were slaughtered. Not a single man survived. It was the bloodiest blow yet against Norman rule, and the signal for full-scale rebellion. News of the Durham massacre spread like wildfire. In York, Northumbrian rebels, aided by exiled Anglo-Saxon nobles, rose in arms. They surrounded the Norman castles, cutting them off from supplies. The garrisons, under constant attack, were barely holding out. When William heard the news in the south, his response was swift and terrifying. In a forced march north, he reached York in days, scattering the rebels and slaughtering any who stood in his path. The castles were reinforced and a new garrison installed. For years, the exiled English nobles had courted one powerful ally, Denmark. King Sweyn II of Denmark dispatched a fleet, 200 ships strong, under his brother, Earl Osbjorn. Sailing up the Humber, they joined forces with the English rebels. In September, the combined Anglo-Danish army descended on York. The Norman castles, now symbols of oppression, became prime targets. The attackers set fire to the city. Flames engulfed streets and homes. Both Norman castles were overrun. The garrisons, perhaps 3,000 men, were slaughtered. For a brief moment, York was free of Norman rule. When news reached William, he was in the south, but he wasted no time. In one of the most grueling marches of the medieval era, he led his army north in the dead of winter, covering the distance in less than a fortnight. The speed of the advance caught the rebels off guard. The Danish fleet, unwilling to face William head-on, retreated to the Humber estuary. The Anglo-Saxon rebels scattered. York was retaken. Again. But this time, William was finished with half measures. What happened next would scar the North for generations.
By late 1069, William had retaken York, but the city he reclaimed was a charred ruin. Twice in a single year, the North had risen against him. Twice, it had taken extraordinary force to crush them. Now, William was done playing the patient king. Some say William acted out of vengeance. a personal desire to punish the North for defying him again and again. Others believe it was a military strategy. Whatever his reasoning, the king gave a simple order: destroy the North. The campaign began in the winter of 1069 and continued into early 1070. Norman forces swept across Yorkshire and parts of Durham, burning villages, slaughtering livestock, and destroying stores of grain. Wells were fouled with corpses. Tools and plows were smashed to splinters. Nothing was left to sustain life. Not for the rebels, not for the loyal, not even for the Norman garrisons.
The Danish fleet lingered at the Humber through the winter, but William struck a deal. King Sweyn's forces would leave England in exchange for silver. With the Danes gone, no foreign army remained to aid the rebels. The North was at William's mercy, and he had none. Historians estimate that more than 100 villages were destroyed. Orderic Vitalis, a Norman chronicler, wrote, "From the Humber to the Tees, not an inhabited village remained. Corpse lay rotting in the streets. The land was without tillage, without life." The destruction was not just military, it was agricultural annihilation. With barns burned and livestock slaughtered, the survivors faced starvation. Contemporary accounts describe people eating horses, dogs, and even human flesh to survive. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mourned that many thousands died of hunger. Some modern historians place the death toll at over 100,000, in an age when the population of England was barely 2 million. By the spring of 1070, the North was quiet, but not because William had won hearts and minds. He had broken them. For decades, the once rich farmland of Yorkshire remained depopulated and economically crippled. The scars, both physical and cultural, would endure for generations. Aftermath and consequences. Over 60% of Yorkshire's land marked as waste in Doomsday Book, uninhabitable and untaxed. Tens of thousands dead from famine and exposure. Entire villages vanished from history. Anglo-Saxon lords replaced by Norman barons. Castles dominated the landscape. No major northern uprising occurred during William's reign. William the Conqueror's throne was won in a single day at Hastings, but secured in the frozen ashes of the north. For generations, Yorkshire bore the scars, in its fields, its people, and its memory. And 1,000 years later, we still remember the winter when life itself was put to the sword. History is written in fire, blood, and silence, but you can keep its memory alive. Join us and let the past speak again.